for American society as the context for what a liberal faith and a free, open, pluralistic environment can be. And so much of the history of our movement and of this institution is involved with the way that Jews have responded to the pressing issues and challenges of different phases of our history as a nation. We're now going to continue this conversation with Gary Zola, who will be presenting in his own inimitable way, unique to Gary, some of his insights from his wonderful research that was part of his book that will be published this fall, the definitive work on the relationship between the Jews of America and Abraham Lincoln. The title of the book, we call him Father Abraham. And we're all eagerly looking forward to that book. To quote the epitaph to Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, if you want to know Gary Zola's introduction, look around you. This building, this institution is a testimony to his creative commitment to raising up the importance of the American Jewish experience as a formative part of our identity and indeed of our religious commitment. So Gary, come and share with us.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me turn this down a little. Is this okay for your recording? Is that all right? Because I'm gonna teach from up here. Is that all right? Okay, great. That's all right? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the American Jewish Archives. Welcome to the historic Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College. And I want to thank Rabbi Berman and the Society for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to participate and to offer a little teaching. Before I do that, you know how they say about rabbis, before we speak, we have something to say. And so, most important, this is no news to the students here. I'd like, on behalf of all of us, to express a word of thanks and gratitude to Mr. Al Samandel. Al is in charge of taking care of the large part of this campus, which is the American Jewish Archives. And he not only makes sure that the building is pristine, but he also takes care of all the electronics, which are pretty considerable in this building. And he will be with the group throughout the conference. And so, Al, we're very grateful for the time you give up, not only during the day, but in the evening, to be with us and make sure everything goes well. And of course, it's a very big honor and very daunting to always, to ever speak on the same podium with Dr. Ellenson, who is a master at presenting himself as in such great modesty. Being a generalist, he's no generalist, he's a great scholar and knows a tremendous amount. And so the people who are always quaking in their shoes when they have to teach is those who are actually doing so with him in the room. So David, it was a wonderful session as always. So Rabbi Berman asked me to talk about some of the founders of our Reform movement and Lincoln, and I'm in keeping with the overall theme. My ambition is not only just to talk about that, but to carry it forward, to take it beyond Lincoln and Wise and Einhorn, and so that's what I hope to do. And in fact, I don't want to speak too much about the book. I don't know if it'll be the definitive study. It is the first time I think anybody has written on Lincoln and the Jews in a large way in about 60 years, since Dr. Korn wrote about it. And where I depart from, or pick up from, I not only cover in this book the period of the Civil War, which is what Korn did so masterfully. But I actually discuss Lincoln and the Jews from before he was president, and I bring it right up to the movie. So, I really cover a whole area, and I don't cut time short. It's going to be about 500 pages. So I hope that everyone will be good and sick of Lincoln and the Jews. But okay, so I prepared some handouts for us, and if I could impose upon you folks, thank you. Now, actually, the president's teaching is a good introduction to where I'm picking up, because he taught you a little bit about Dr. Einhorn, and also spoke about Rabbi Wise, Dr. Wise, and so I don't have to tell you too much about these two, because in terms of biography, the president shared some of those comments with you. So let's just pick up with this whole topic of the Civil War, slavery, Lincoln, and these two leaders. Of course, the whole topic of the rabbinate in America during this period of time, and the rabbinate's interest in the issue of slavery and so forth, is a topic unto itself. And that might have been even a very interesting topic, because since Dr. Sussman has written a definitive biography on Isaac Leeser, as everyone knows, and Leeser, in certain ways, had such a big role to play back then, because he was a newspaper man, and he, like Wise, had an audience. But we're going to focus on Wise and Einhorn. And in fact, I provide translations for some material that has never been translated from the German into the English in this book, that will enable us to see some of the things that Einhorn thought and said about Lincoln. And I shared a little with you here. So let's begin when Lincoln is elected. And as you know, he's elected in November of 1860. He'll take office in 1861 in March. And Wise begins to write about Lincoln already during the campaign. He does so in his newspaper, The Israelite. And Wise is clearly not a Lincoln proponent. And this was very important to the people who critiqued my book. One of the big critiques before it was published was, didn't any Jew hate Lincoln? There must have been someone who hated Lincoln. And it really was very hard to find examples of people who out and out during his lifetime hated Lincoln. But Wise was one of the best I could offer up, because he had, let's say, ambivalence about Lincoln. And you'll understand that in just a minute when you see his own writing. So Wise was politically a Democrat, and he had been a Democrat for a long time. And what that meant was that Wise was a Democrat, meaning he certainly was, I don't believe, although there is a whole line of thinking. There's been accusations made by one historian by the name of Henry Feingold that Wise was out and out a bigot. And he cites a quotation from a newspaper that I think most believe, and Korn has already pointed this out, is a misquote. So I'd like to start by saying that if anyone ever shows you quotations about Isaac Mayer Wise where he says actually hostile, racial, bigoted comments about the African Americans, I think you want to run to a scholar and make sure that it's actually been checked out, because this still floats around and it's, I don't think, accurate. I couldn't find anything.
Yeah.
Yes?
Just one question. Would such a statement, I mean, since I haven't ever seen that, be unusual in the context of the time? In other words,
Yes.
I'm not trying to say that it's not bigoted, but it,
Even the Southern rabbis who speak about the rights of the Southerners to hold slavery. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about saying that the race of the blacks is a second-class race and don't deserve any better. That's a quote that's been ascribed to Wise. I don't believe, even the Southern rabbis, I've never seen such quotes. They just stand on the principle that this is our property. But yeah, so yes.
I didn't mean.
Yeah, go ahead, please. No, go ahead.
So
We
in
got a lot of learned people here.
1860,
Yeah.
Rabbi Raffel in New York. gives-
Yeah, I'm going to get to that.
And he really says that blacks were destined by providence, by God, who made them to be slaves.
Well,
They're inferior, and therefore they're workers.
well, yes, he does. He connects it up to the biblical curse of Ham. But I'll just say that the comment that Wise is sometimes, according to Feingold, is even worse than this, and so forth. But back to where I wanted to head here is that Wise is clearly, no surprise, Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Hebrew Union College. Isaac Wise is all in favor of union. And he does not want the union to be burst asunder. And this upsets him, something awful, that the union might collapse. He thinks this is a tremendous calamity, and he is much more interested, this is true, in preserving the union than in the issue of slavery. So he considers the Republicans, especially the wing of the Republicans that are sometimes called the Black Republicans, those who are the most ardently wanting to end slavery. He considers them to be a destructive force for the Union. And so he's not in favor of it. Now in 1860, when Lincoln is elected, Wise first believes that ultimately he believes that the war will not happen. He's convinced that the country will come together, and he believes it will happen because of economic reasons. Because if the South and the North split, there'll be such an economic devastation to both that the bankers and the rich people will say to themselves, oh my God, we really stand to lose a lot of money. This is terrible. And they'll find a way to bring things together. So if you open up the booklet and you take a look at a comment he makes just shortly after the election, it's more than a comment. He's writing as the editor of the Israelite on the 30th of November, 1860. And if you take a look at the first paragraph, I'm only going to read parts of this. You can take this home and enjoy it. But he's a businessman. And he says in his first paragraph, he wants you to know that whether you're from the South or from the North, it doesn't matter. I'll take payment for my magazine in any currency. And this leads him into what will become he perseveres on this idea. He hates what he calls the extremist factions. He hates the extreme on the one side and on the other. So the Northerners, who are hell-bent on disbanding slavery and who are going to interfere with the property of the South, are one extreme. And then in the South, those people who are so cranked up to the point that they can't see the potential problems, the issues that worry the Northerners, are the other problem, and he calls for moderation. If you take a look at the last half of the second paragraph, you can read it on your own, he says that, that the war is really not going to take place. So don't worry. Everything's going to be okay. And if you turn to page 2, he says, and if you don't think that I know enough about this subject, readers, he says, I just want to bring to you, if you don't have enough faith in me, go take a look. I clipped something out of the New York Times. And I provided the New York Times for you, and he says the New York Times actually underscores what I'm saying. So he says, and let's read that, I'll read that with you. What are we to concede? This is from the New York Times that Wise is printing in his paper. Can any of all the opponents of Mr. Lincoln here in the North tell of all the issues which have from time to time, since the beginning of the government, so far as regards to the slavery question, been discussed by the people, there are none of which Mr. Lincoln has not given responses in accordance with the former Southern demands. In other words, as you'll see when you read through this, he's saying, Lincoln, whatever is said before the election, don't worry. It's like all these politicians, he's saying. You know, they say all sorts of things on the way to the White House, but now they're in the White House, they'll return to, you know, a normal sense of things. And he says, and he proves it, the author from the New York Times. He says, Lincoln has said he will comply with the constitutional requirements to deliver fugitive slaves. This was upsetting, you know, in other words, that slaves might run away to the North, and the North wouldn't return them. Lincoln does say, you know, he wouldn't interfere with that. Then he says, and he will not oppose the interstate trade in the slaves. And he will not oppose the admission of new states applying to be admitted with slavery. And he will not advocate the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia unless the owners of the slaves themselves ask for it and are compensated. And he abjures all claim on the part of the federal government to interfere with slavery in the states. What more in the name of all of that is just can be asked from a man or the party? So the reason that Wise is bringing this forward is Wise is trying to say, you see, Lincoln, whatever he said, he's not going to do any of that. Goes to show you why we should always remember the words of the prophet. I am neither the prophet or the son of a prophet. You know, I don't know why. It always seems that historians are asked to talk more about the future and less about the past, and we know so little about the future. And then he says in the next paragraph, he says, the bankers, stock jobbers, and the brokers, they have made a mistake. Read what he says. He says, they started to cry the cry of bankruptcy with the intention to make money of it. But now the flames they themselves have started will envelop them. Now they themselves must quench the fire, or they will have the worst part of their hasty transaction. All of these people who were pounding on either side and have brought us to this calamity, they're going to, because of money, they're going to pull back from it, he says, and the country will be fine. I didn't bring all the rest of this, but he pokes fun, Wise pokes fun at Lincoln, really consistently until his famous eulogy, which is so famous. I didn't bring the eulogy, but you know, Lincoln gives this remarkable eulogy. Wise does. Wise is, what a character he was. I mean, only a man like that could have started the Hebrew Union College. And he says everybody else, of course, all the other rabbis cry and crocodile tears over Lincoln, no doubt about it. But only Wise literally says, brethren, he says, the fallen president believed himself to be of Hebrew parentage. He told me that himself. Of course, the man's dead, so he can't counter. He says, and if you take a look at him, he says this in his eulogy, you will see that he possesses the countenance as well as his moral character of our people. And everyone knows Lincoln didn't even have red hair. But you know, this is the kind of, you know, he calls him a messiah once he's deceased. But during his life, he pokes fun at him for all sorts of things. But the reason I limited myself to the quotes I brought here is because very often he'll poke fun at Lincoln over things that I didn't want to get into, but just to tell you about it. For example, right at the beginning, Lincoln in his first inaugural makes reference to the fact, and he goes over this particular beautiful phrase with William Seward. And he talks about, at the end of his first inaugural, we've got to stand together, Lincoln says. He says, after all, we're all connected. And he makes some allusion to the fact that we're all Christians. See, so Wise, of course, doesn't like this. And Wise then, in criticizing this, doesn't go so far as just to criticize. He says, you know, what can you expect, he says, from Lincoln? And he says, Lincoln barely knows how to speak English. I'm not kidding you. This is in my book. I mean, here, this is the chutzpah of our founder, that here he's a German migrant who probably spoke English with a big fat accent, and he's criticizing a man who's become known as the most eloquent man in all of American history, but that didn't stop him. I mean, he did this in Charleston, too. You know, he criticized Poznański, right? He called him a Polak when he went down there, you know. So Wise was a cantankerous person. He also, when they elect Lincoln and they have parties for him, he criticizes all the money that's being spent on Lincoln's parties. He says, look at the problems we're having in our country. He says, and they're making parties for Abraham Lincoln? You know, these are the kinds of criticisms that he comes up with. But the one that I brought that's on page 3 that is really remarkable is when he literally refers to, not to Lincoln personally, but in a sense to Lincoln's actions. He calls him an imbecile. Now, if you read, this is, of course, in 1864. This is before the election. Some of you who know your history know that Lincoln was literally fearful that he wouldn't be reelected. The war wasn't going that well. There had been some victories, but then there was some defeats, and the fear was that the country had tired of the war, and they wanted to end it. They wanted a negotiated peace. And I think that, truthfully, Wise would have preferred that. And so, by the way, one of my discoveries in the book, this is just an aside, is, to tantalize you so you'll want to buy my book, is I found a document that actually, in the Library of Congress, that was misfiled, that has never been published before, which proves that Lincoln's Jewish foot doctor, a man by the name of HUC-JIR, this has, by the way, nothing to do with classical Reform Judaism. HUC-JIR was arranged for a private meeting with the approval of Lincoln and Seward, with Judah P. Benjamin and 4 leaders from the South in September to negotiate an end to the war. Just as it happened in the movie. This happened numerous times, by the way. But the unique thing with this is that HUC-JIR tells Lincoln and Seward, if he can talk, he's a Jew, he can talk to Judah P. Benjamin, he can make this happen. Oh. And in fact, we have a letter that Judah P. Benjamin, that HUC-JIR writes to Judah P. Benjamin the day after the meeting. And he recounts what happened at the meeting, and he says he's so thrilled with the reception he got from Judah P. Benjamin, he will go to Lincoln and hopes to negotiate, that something good will come out of it. And of course, we know and knew for quite some time that when this got back to Lincoln and to Seward, it was killed right away, and this upset Zachary very much. Just in the same way that you saw in the movie that it happened, that Lincoln sort of leads it along and then won't let it happen, which is, by the way, a part of a repetitive style in terms of his leadership. But if you look at this paper, I'm going to read at the second paragraph on page 3, and again you'll see how he wants to bring this war to an end, and you'll see how upset he is, Wise, with the factions. He says, 2 factions, one holding slavery to be a divine institution and the basis of civilized society, and the other considering it intolerable, disgraceful, and outrageous. 2 extremes. This is why I keep, and this is, by the way, repetitive in Wise's literature. He can't stand extremes. He wants moderation. He wants, and those of us who really know a little bit about his history in Reform Judaism know that that was the case with Reform. He was not a radical reformer. He was a moderate. He was a moderate in all that he did. And it's true, everything that the president said, because if the president said it, it's true. But we also know that Wise did not want to hire a historian who, at the end of his career, did not want to hire a historian here who would not declare the divinity of the Ten Commandments. So there were limits to his science. He was a scientist, but there was a limit. If you couldn't say that God gave us the Ten Commandments, you shouldn't teach here. At least that was Wise's opinion. Kohler had a different view. So he can't stand extremes. And to go back to the text, he says, these two extremes hurled this country into an abyss of destruction. Both factions are as mad, unscrupulous, reckless, and fanatic today after 1 million men were buried and crippled, as they were 10 years ago, when either of them was considered as a harmless fanatic. By the way, this sometimes does worry me, because I don't believe that history repeats itself. I see no evidence of that. But we do live at a time when there's extremism. And there's as you read about what led up to the Civil War, you feel these people, for example, this is an apolitical comment, but so I don't mean to upset anybody, but when you look at the realpolitik around various parts of the country that are voting for different sides, you'd think certain parties would say, okay, well, look, the most important thing is we got to get elected, so we're going to have to moderate our views in order to make sure that we can get elected. And when you see the refusal on either side to moderate, because it's more important principle than to find solutions, which I think we would all agree prevails today, it does remind me of that same period led into the Civil War. That's what he's saying. There's no give. And now look, millions of people have died as a result of it, he says. And then he says, these extremes are still as extreme as they were, and they sway the scepter of power as they once did. A man must either hate every man, woman, and child in the rebellious states, or must worship them as demigods. He must either speak of exterminating them and beg their pardon in order to belong to the one or the other faction. Either he must rejoice over the defeat of our armies and pray for their destruction, or must blindly admire the blunders of our military leaders and shout Hosanna to Abraham Lincoln and his 1,001 demonstrations of imbecility. I don't think I'm twisting the text when I say he's referring to Lincoln as an imbecile. This is the same man who, only a year and a half later will say he's one of the Jewish people. He told me so himself. Gotta love Wise. And then to bring it forward, he says, either one must believe the Negro was created to be a beast of burden to others, or you must say he is just as good as you are in order to gratify your neighbors. And that tells us a lot about his view. Right there. In other words, Wise is a pragmatist. He's not an ideologue. So he doesn't, he doesn't like the people on the one hand who are saying, and that's why I find that line that was quoted from Feingold hard to believe he would say, because he says right here, that doesn't mean he doesn't contradict himself though, but he says, that the Negro is created to be a beast of burden. He doesn't believe in that. Wise thinks that's an extreme statement. On the other hand, he doesn't want to end slavery, because it's more important to him to preserve the Union. Now, leaving that, let's go to Einhorn. Because one of our founders of the Reform movement in America has these views, right, of moderation and go down the middle, whereas Einhorn is a completely different character. And by the way, just a word that many of the most ardent supporters of what were called the Black Republicans, or the most passionate opponents on the North to slavery, were from the German migration. Dr. Sussman has taught us that we need to always remember in the 19th century that the German migration, I'm not just talking about the Jews, I'm talking about the German in general, that migration is the largest ethnic migration to this country in all of our history. And the 19th century was a heyday for that. And in that migration were many Jews, right? And so many of the most outspoken opponents to slavery were those Germans who had been active in liberalizing activities in Central Europe, who fled from that because they felt it was going to fail, they couldn't get their way in Europe, the reactionary backlash, and they come to America and they find themselves in a country that has slavery, and those who are in the North, take slavery up as a passionate issue. And so Einhorn is part of that world, but Einhorn's more than that. Einhorn has a view of the rabbinate, which is very ideological. And so, as you'll see from his writings, if you haven't seen this stuff, it's very interesting. This is very important, I think, to study this. So Dr. Sussman pointed out that in December of 1860, the South Carolina secedes from the Union. According to the story, President Buchanan's at a New Year's party, and they come in and they bring him the word of secession. And you know, he's been criticized by historians plenty, Buchanan. Apparently Buchanan falls into his chair, and they can't get him to respond for an hour. He's paralyzed by this news, doesn't know what to do. Finally, when he pulls himself together, he decides he's going to convene a day of lamentation and humiliation and prayer for the nation. So he declares that January the 4th, 1861, will be a day of prayer. He calls on all Americans to go into their houses of worship and to pray. And so Morris Raphael at Temple B'nai Jeshurun in New York delivers a famous address called A Biblical View of Slavery. And in this, he makes three very important points. The third point is often forgotten. The first point that he makes is that slavery is biblically a reality, that we know slavery exists and it's in the Bible. Second, he points out, as Lance indicated, that there's a difference between the Hebrew slave and people who are slaves from others in the Bible. And then he makes a point, number 3, which is often overlooked, where he says, at the end, he says, the South is not promoting a biblical view of slavery. He says, because the South is promoting a kind of slavery where human beings are made into property, into chattel, and that's not the biblical view of slavery. And he then calls essentially for the same thing as wise. He says, if the Northerners could just be a bit more tolerant, and the Southerners could be a bit more tolerant, we can avoid this calamity. Einhorn reads this, as do others, and Einhorn writes a fiery retort. And if you want to read a bit of it, you can see up there in the first paragraph, he dismantles. This is coming, this noise, by the way, from cell phones, so if you have to keep your cell phone on, it's just, the room is very sensitive when the mics are on. But if you see that he dismantles Raphael in a long diatribe. He finds. I mean, you can see some of the lines he says. In the second paragraph, he says the last sentence on this page. He's at page 5. He says, to declare the institution of slavery on behalf of Judaism as a holy institution sanctioned by God, meaning that there is Bible. The Bible says there's such a thing as slavery, Against such a disgrace, the Jewish religious press must object. By the way, I think, Lance, this is a swipe at both Wise and Leeser. Because both Wise and Leeser, I've shown you Wise already, Leeser, who we're not going to look at, but Leeser too, didn't stand up against slavery. So I think this is a swipe that Einhorn's taking.
And that's why he says Jewish religious press.
Yes, yeah. Right. In other words, that these two prominent people don't say a damn thing. He says, if it does not want to brand itself and Judaism forever, and he really criticizes, he gets all worked. Well, then the action starts to happen. So you turn the page, and this is a translation of a German testimony that Einhorn writes in his own newspaper, the Sinai. And it's much of his newspaper has never been translated. And we would learn a lot if we could get a good English translation of the Sinai. But we do have this little portion that's been translated, and this is Einhorn's own story of how he ends up being Rabbi Sussman's predecessor. Because he was at Har Sinai in Baltimore. Baltimore, you know, almost seceded from the Union. And in fact, he says that when he began to publish and to speak about this sermon that Raphael gave in New York, people in his community start to go after him. You can see it for yourself. He says they tell him to stop writing about this, and they tell him to soft pedal it. If you take a look, for example, in the second paragraph, he says, I'm starting in the second paragraph, the second sentence begins with the word truths. Truths which have any connection at all with the burning question of slavery lost their former inoffensiveness. In other words, once this happened and I started to talk about my opposition, suddenly I couldn't find anybody who shared my view. He said, and began to frighten people, or even to be considered as crimes, whether expressed in writing or in words, and any reference to slavery itself, in any sense which did not coincide with the views of Southerners, was regarded altogether as unheard of, as an unheard of bold action bordering on madness. And then if you read on, he says, to my profound sorrow, I saw that even my own congregation wasn't with me. And then he says, if you read on, he says, and then something happened on April the 19th. This is a famous incident, only famous to historians, but it's on April the 19th, a group of soldiers from Massachusetts was making its way down to the nation's capital to defend the capital. And they decide they're going to march through Baltimore. And the Southerners don't want that to happen. The Southern-leaning Baltimoreans, if that's the expression, they don't want that to happen. So this is called the Pratt Street Riot. And famously, Lincoln says, you know, he says, I don't know how our soldiers are going to get to Washington, D.C. if they can't fly or they can't burrow under the ground. They're going to have to go through Baltimore. And so they do go through Baltimore, and there is a collision. And on April the 19th, 4 soldiers, Union soldiers, are killed, and 14 of the civilians are killed who fight against them, which is a bloody mess, and it spills out into a huge riot in the city. And if you take a look, you'll see that Einhorn says that when this happens on the 19th, I'm now on page 7, this was the situation when on the 19th, the revolution broke out in Baltimore. This is what he's talking about. And what happens is his people, the few people who are his friends, urge him to flee. Einhorn doesn't want to flee. He wants to stay. But they persuade him that his family's in danger. So he and his family go up to Philadelphia. And then, and I want you to pay attention to this, he says he plans all the time. He insists, and this is because he was accused of being a coward, that he ran away, that his people wanted him, and that he ran away. He explains in here that that's not the case, that he was prepared to come back, that he became ill. And he was delayed in coming back, but he was planning to come back for Shavuot. And then he says he gets this letter. You can see the letter for yourself. Very interesting, because in a minute we're going to take a look at what HUC-JIR says about this letter. It shows to show you how history is sometimes ornamented. And he says, I received this letter, and I decided I wasn't going to go back. If you read the letter, the president essentially says to him, we want you to come back. They want him. But what do they say to him? What do they say? What does he got to do?
He says to stay quiet on all the
That's right.
controversial
That's
stuff.
right. Don't speak out. And Einhorn won't hear of it. And so he remains to become Rabbi Lance Sussman's predecessor. Now, if you turn the page, you'll see some very interesting things. Interesting, from the other side, often Einhorn felt that Lincoln was, at the beginning, was not as courageous as he should have been. When you see what you have here, you won't be surprised that Wise thought Lincoln was a bumbler because he didn't hold the Union together. And Einhorn felt Lincoln didn't do enough to follow the ideology. But it doesn't carry on the way Lincoln does, because after all, Einhorn primarily speaks about himself as a rabbi and as a Jew, having to call out what's going on. But once Lincoln dies, look at what he does. Einhorn goes even as far as I found any of the rabbis. Many of them do, but Einhorn goes back and he makes Lincoln into a Jew. So these quotes that I pulled from the eulogy, you can read some of them. They're all very interesting. I mean, in one place, he refers to Lincoln as Moses. But take a look at number 5, which I thought was so interesting. He says, if Abraham Lincoln had one flaw, and this is why I tell you that Einhorn ironically criticizes Lincoln for, look what he says. He says, it was his excessive leniency toward the rebels. He whom the demagogues and the murderer decried as a tyrant. The sin of Moses was, because he had compared Moses earlier in the eulogy, he compares Lincoln to Moses. He says, well, Moses' sin was that he struck the rock to give water to the thirsting people, whereas God just told him to speak to the rock. So Moses didn't follow God's law because, he got angry. But just the opposite sin is what Lincoln does. Lincoln doesn't get angry enough. He says, the reverse holds true for Abraham Lincoln, who believed that by speaking to the rebels kindly, by treating them kindly, he could bend their rock-hard neck in order to bring us the blessing of peace, whereas this neck can be made to yield only with the use of force. How do you like that? Grant us peace. And here's what I couldn't believe what he says. Look on number 7. He actually says that Lincoln died for Kiddush Hashem. He uses that phrase. Mosaic law requires that when the corpse of a murdered person is found, then the murderer could not be apprehended. A sacrifice be brought because the people feel impure and in need of atonement before the murderer is discovered. We find ourselves in the same situation, in that we need to dry the tears of those who shed their blood for us. Lincoln. Let these be our sacrifices. Thus, everyone will gladly contribute his part, because it is a question of Kiddush Hashem, honoring martyrdom and honoring him who shielded us, also as Israelites, and embraced us with a loving heart. So in short, to summarize that, and now I'm going to go into the beyond, which is what Rabbi Berman urged me to do, not just stay in the Civil War. In short, Wise was critical of Lincoln for being a bumbler, for being inarticulate, for not being careful with his words, and for sure for allowing the extremists to hold sway, instead of doing what he could to promote moderation, which was his view, not only politically but religiously. Einhorn, on the other hand, was a immovable ideologue. And if he had one criticism of President Lincoln, who he admired, it was he was too flexible. So in a sense, they're opposite extremes, both of whom are founders of our movement. And there's a lot of thinking I invite you to do about this, because it prevails to this day in terms of how we carry ourselves forward. Now, how does this carry on? Well, if you turn the page, page 13, you see I've presented to you this famous plank from the Pittsburgh platform. And as Rabbi Ellenson taught us, most of the Pittsburgh platform was sort of carried in by Kaufman Kohler. But there was one plank which wasn't present in the original 10 that the 19 rabbis were invited to consider, and it was brought in and introduced by Emil G. Hirsch. And there it is. And one of the things that my students will confirm is that I point out that, just as Dr. Sussman urged us to today, one way in which we don't cut ourselves off from a history of pride is by pointing out that there's no student today on any campus of the Hebrew Union College, and I doubt very much if there are very many Reform Jews anywhere, under any banner, who would look at this statement and wouldn't say, I agree with this. This is what we should be doing. And here's a statement in which we can take pride. So it's not fair, as Rabbi Ellenson pointed out, it's not fair, it's not historical, it's not appropriate to simply pull one or two planks from the Pittsburgh platform and not set it into context and just say, like Rabbi Wolf, who I grew up with at camp in Oconomowoc, and that was par for the course with him. I mean, when you looked up in the dictionary controversy, his picture was right there. So this comes from Emil Hirsch. We've already heard from Rabbi Ellenson, Dr. Ellenson, that Emil Hirsch is the son-in-law. He married Einhorn's daughter, Matilda. And he clearly loves him. That is, Hirsch loves Einhorn. And take a look at what he says about him on page 14, when he says, 25 years after Einhorn passes away, he writes a beautiful tribute. And I just excerpt some parts of this tribute. And look what he says, the last two paragraphs before the divider in the page. He says, it's very interesting, this is Hirsch talking about his father-in-law Einhorn. He says, he talked politics in the pulpit as long as humanity decreed that it should be taught. Meaning, if there were issues that needed to be brought, he did. The Jew who knows his mission will be the leader in every movement making for a better, nobler, deeper life. He will be the last to bend his knee before the money bag. That was the intention of the Reform Synagogue, and of the Reform Synagogue, and of the Reform movement, and was there to be positive, not negative. The Reform movement is to bring to the Jews the understanding of their duty, not to themselves, but to the world at large. Now, in case we should think, either here today in the society, at the Hebrew Union College among our students, or among the leadership of our movement, that we've lost our way today, and that's never happened before, I invite you to read his next line. Sycophants and flatterers, idiots and ninnies are now the leaders of American Reform Judaism. Now, I urge you to remember that he's not talking about Dr. Ellenson. This is long ago, right? This man's been gone a long time, right? Indifference, like a Paul and a pallor, that brings conceit all over a conceit of the pocketbook or of a culture, because where some have learned to sell shoes, others have learned to sell shoes, others have learned to sell doctor's knowledge and legal tricks whereby to defeat death, or the sheriff's constable's culture, the conceit of one, or of money, the conceit of the other, a grave, the synagogue in Europe and here and all over. Has he lived for naught? He's talking about Einhorn. Has he lived for naught? I believe not. For the day will come when the world will feel that he lived, and they will pilgrim to his grave, grateful for what he was and what he taught. And as for me, he has risen to those heights where they shine with a luster of the stars, who have taught many and brought many to righteousness. We need his inspiration. The few of us who have their moments of despair, we need to remember how he suffered, how he struggled, not like the cowards who run away. He's urging, people to take a stand. And we've talked about this, haven't we, students, how hard it is to do that today. All you have to do in a congregation today is simply stand up and say, according to the Bible, it says that, it's our job to take care of those who are sick and to take care of the widow and the orphan, which is in the scriptures. And the next thing you know, somebody's going to walk up to you and say, listen, I didn't come to the synagogue to hear a political speech. It's a problem. It's a problem. And I was in Dallas, I was in Dallas, and somebody at your congregation actually came up to me and said, Max, why don't the young rabbis who come talk like Rabbi Olin, and give us hell, and tell us, what we need to do. And I had to say, they like to hold on to their jobs, and not all of them are ready to do what Einhorn did. But this is what he wants you to do. Otherwise, he thinks you're a ninny. Now, but you see that Einhorn was taken by this issue from Lincoln's day, and it brings him to introduce this into the platform of Reform Judaism. And then I want you to see something else that you make, the Lincoln connection. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a resurgence, although this had gone on all the time from the Civil War, but there was a terrible resurgence in lynching of the African Americans. And this was making headlines all over the country. In 1907, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, terrible, terrible riots. Awful. You should read about them. There's a PBS program you can see on the internet about the Tulsa riots of 1907. Calamitous. The whites became so inflamed that they burned down blocks and blocks and blocks in the African American neighborhood, and literally it's been estimated that 10,000 people went homeless as a result of that, and many people were killed. But then, interestingly, the following year in 1908, in Springfield, Illinois, of all places, the president's home, there were 2 blacks who were lynched over what was called the Springfield riots. And this finally gives rise to a group of liberals, primarily in New York City, who want to organize an effort to lift up the African American, and they will come together in a meeting, and they'll call for the creation of a society to advance the African American. And this will become the beginning of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. And just read this on your own on page 12, but just turn to page 15, and then on page 16 you see some of the names of the people who signed this letter, and there are 2 rabbis on it. One is Emil G. Hirsch of Chicago, and the other is Rabbi Wise, and this will bring me to our other founder in just a minute. And if you're interested, Rabbi Hirsch was very, very committed to this idea of the equality of the races. And he spoke out in Chicago. So the New York Times covers a speech that took place in New York where he addresses the Republican Club along with some others. And you can read much of it yourself, but I read the middle paragraph out loud because it just captures what Emil Hirsch did. Again, to stay with me so you know what I'm talking about, is I'm trying to point out how Wise and Einhorn begin with this issue during the Civil War, and then Einhorn's impact on his son-in-law is great, and it influences not only the reform movement by introducing this plank into the Pittsburgh Platform, which will shape the whole future of Reform Judaism in America, as we'll see in a minute, but he himself, Emil Hirsch, becomes very personally involved in the rights of the individual. And just listen to what he says. He says, and this is Hirsch talking as quoted in the New York Times. They find, he said, that they are charged with the vices from which they know they are free. They must react on their attitude toward morality, and it must reduce the resistance of the community to evil. In the days of slavery, the slaveholder paid dearly for the injuries slavery brought on the community. Rome fell, quotes the Talmud. Rome fell because it was a slave-holding state, and its slaves corrupted it. The community that permits wrong will ultimately be called to the judgment bar and pay the penalty for its lack of resistance. Race prejudice says to its victim, you are judged not as individuals, but as members of a class. And though you appeal to the better knowledge of your neighbors, you are prejudiced before you are called to the witness stand. This must result in the evolution of a chosen class with privileges that can't be taken away, and this is essentially un-American, and the American who harbors race prejudice is committing a crime against Americanism. This is in 1911, only a few years after the start. Now I found a letter that has not been published, and we're coming to the end of my time, and then maybe there are questions or comments. I'm sure my colleagues are holding back to dismantle certain things I've said, but just in July 1947, I found this letter that actually comes from the Hirsch family that Stephen Wise wrote to Emil Hirsch's daughter. And Mrs. Hirsch, Matilda, that is the daughter of Einhorn, is still alive. Ironically, she's going to outlive even Stephen Wise by a few months. And if you read the second paragraph, he talks about the impact that Emil Hirsch, that is Stephen Wise. Remember, these are two men. And this, I thought of this when Dr. Sussman was speaking again today. You read this, tell me if it doesn't ring of sincerity. These are two men who did not share common views on everything. Stephen Wise and Emil Hirsch. They didn't have the same view. But read what Wise says about Emil Hirsch. And I think he's being sincere. I don't think this is just letter. These letters repeat themselves again and again. Stephen Wise really admired this man and praises him. Look what he says. He says, let's just do the fourth paragraph, the second before the end. He says, your dear mother is only 21 years ahead of me. I am afraid that father was only 71 when he passed. I wish he might have added years. I never weary of telling publicly and privately that he was the only really great person outside of Einhorn in the history of the American Jewish pulpit.
Isaac M. Wise was a wonderful organizer and administrator. Emil G., your father, was a great scholar, had prophetic wisdom, and was a great Jew and a great man. I cherish his precious memory almost as do you. Now this, friends, in a minute you'll see it, this is coming from a man who rarely had room in his ego to say that anybody else was his equal, which again is part of what made it possible for Stephen Wise to do all the things that he did. The only other person I've seen him praise like this was Herzl. He was totally taken by Herzl. Interestingly, if you read Edgar Magnon's materials, Magnon writes about when Magnon was a student here in 1915, that they invited Emil Hirsch to come down from Chicago and teach. And you have to know Magnon, right, to appreciate this, and maybe Dr. Ellenson will add here, because Magnon didn't deliver himself as a scholar or as a, an intellect. But Marcus used to say to me all the time, Edgar Magnon is no fool. Edgar Magnon is one of the smartest men in the American rabbinate. And Marcus wrote his eulogy, his necrology, and he says exactly that in print. And Magnon writes in his, that in all his life, he never met a man like Emil G. Hirsch.
When I first became a professor at Hebrew Union in 1979, actually Rick and I were appointed the same year, I worked for about 3 or 4 years for my holidays at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, which was Rabbi Magnon's temple. And as Robert and others could tell you, Wilshire Boulevard Temple was certainly the synagogue, the temple in LA. And Rabbi Magnon was still there. He told me that he'd only met one genius in his entire life, and that was Emil G. Hirsch. He said that Hirsch really was a genius, and in publications like the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1907, Kaufman, Kohler, and Hirsch published an inordinate number of articles. These two men who were both the sons-in-law of Einhorn, how did the two of them get along? I'm just curious.
Emil Hirsch and Kaufman Kohler?
Yeah.
Gee, I can't remember. Maybe you do. I don't remember one way or another. Nothing jumped out of me. I do remember reading that interestingly, that and this just goes to show you how politics, in our rabbinate and in our, it's unbelievable, that the first rabbi who was a bona fide political Zionist graduate of Cincinnati campus was a man named Max Heller, who was a rabbi in New Orleans. And Max Heller announced his Zionism as soon as Isaac Wise died. And then he becomes a vice president of the American Federation of Zionists, and he becomes the vice president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis.
Doesn't he write the biography of Wise, Heller?
No, that's his son,
Oh, that's
Jimmy
his
Heller.
son who does
Right. And so Max Heller is now up to be the president of the CCAR. He's going to succeed to the presidency, but many of our colleagues at the time felt that it was inappropriate for a man who was the vice president of the, honorary vice president of the Zionists to also be the president of the CCAR. And so there was a movement afoot to dethrone him. And interestingly enough, Stephen Wise works against him. Stephen Wise wants Emil G. Hirsch. In other words, I'm using this to point out how much he loved Hirsch, because Zionism, which meant so much to Wise, you would think this would be great for Wise, right? He would want a Zionist to ascend to the presidency. But in this case, the admiration he had for Emil G. Hirsch trumped this. And Hirsch and Wise, both of them, had they were bigger than the conference. Wise says this, Stephen Wise says, he said, I don't need the conference. The conference I need, the conference, the rabbis need the conference because they're little. He says, I'm bigger than all of them. I don't need the CCR.
Is Hirsch anti-Zionist or just kind of?
This is, again, he's sort of I think non-Zionist. Masliansky, this person I wrote on for my rabbinic thesis, goes and visits him, and he says, you cannot pin down Emil Hirsch on Zionism, he says. He says, sometimes he's a Zionist, sometimes he's not. But did you want to add something?
The only thing I wanted to add that's been interesting for me today in hearing all this is that, once again, you just see how complex our heritages are. In other words, on issues like Zionism, Wise, as opposed to what we would call the classical reformer, Stephen Wise, clearly departed. On issues like liturgy, etc., Isaac Meirwise is hardly our image of what we would call classical reform, and yet clearly on the issue of social justice, Stephen Wise, Emil G. Hirsch, Einhorn, Kaufman Kohler, they're cut of a single cloth.
Absolutely.
And depending on the situation, they move in different directions.
I want to say one thing that I can't prove scientifically, but maybe Lance has looked at this, but I've often felt, I must say, that the issue of Zionism, this is just not based on science, it's just based on impressionism. The issue of Zionism was a much more important issue to rabbis than it was to their congregants. I don't find any evidence that, in other words, all of it came through the rabbis. And the congregants, it wasn't as big, even the German congregants, wasn't as big of an issue as it was to their rabbis. But a few comments, and then I want to, don't want to leave Stephen Wise out. He's one of our founders. So, yes.
Just to amplify what David is saying, there are so many nuances. End of the 19th century, you have Isaac Meirwise, who's now here at the college. You have the two sons.
Lance, just a little louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. You have at the end of the 19th century, right at the time when the Union Prayer Book will be issued by the CCAR. Oh, thank you. You have so many shades of Reform Judaism all at once. You have Isaac Meirwise here at the college. Kaufman Kohler is going to be in Detroit and New York. He's very academic and he's passionately reforming. Debates Kohut and others, and then his brother-in-law, Hirsch, is in Chicago. I think they got along. As a matter of fact, I think they also enjoyed together the company of Solomon Schechter later. And they would go off on vacation together. There was not personal animosity. I would say in rating them, just to play that game, that Emil Hirsch was the most radical of the group, and even more radical than David Einhorn. I think he was closest to his own father, Samuel Hirsch. Samuel Hirsch, who was also at KI, and Einhorn had a terrible public falling out. And it was a question of mixed marriage. And Hirsch was more liberal than Einhorn on that subject. Okay? And most of the congregations that I'm aware of that didn't take the UPB was because the UPB, the Union Prayer Book, was too traditional. So the Hirsches and the Krauskopfs and Felly and others maintained their own prayer books, sometimes for many years, because they felt the Union Prayer Book was still too close, even after it was revised, to Wise. And it was not Einhornian enough and not universal enough. And that would have been the position.
And by the way, again, now the rest of you, to the society members, this is now, like Dr. Ellenson said, dueling footnotes. But in my little monograph on the Americanization of the prayer book, I try to make the case that the reason they didn't like Isaac Moses's version was it was too traditional. That's what made them reject it. Not just that it was one man who wrote it, but that it had too much Hebrew in it and they wanted it a different flavor.
The last footnote, the dueling footnotes, the Reformed Jewish Advocate, that was the name also of Emil Hirsch's paper. So that tradition lives through this.
So,
this
accident that Howard picked that name.
Rabbi Berman and then Dr. Saracen.
His observation about nuance. Emil G. Hirsch, Stephen S. Wise, and Abba Hillel Silver were the three liturgically most radical reformers in the country, with Sunday morning services completely in English. And yet, of course, if you ask who some of the great Zionists were, Stephen Wise and Abba Hillel Silver. Kohler and Hirsch were brothers-in-law, but not exactly totally in sync. And when Kohler invited Hirsch to come and lecture at HUC, Hirsch turned him down. And Hirsch later aligned with Stephen Wise in the founding of JIR in New York, and remained very, very close to the New York campus, whose library, to this day, is the Hirsch-Levy Library, because it was Emil G. Hirsch's personal
It's great.
collection.
And
I
so,
don't know about this, I believe the president.
well, I'll tell you one other delicious tidbit. There's, in writing, only one encounter between our two founders. And the president will really appreciate this coming from me. There's only one written connection between Isaac M. Wise and Stephen Wise. And we have it right here at the American Jewish Archives. In the early 1890s, Stephen Wise writes to Isaac Wise and asks if he can gain admission to the Hebrew Union College. And he continues on by saying, but he would only like to come here for 1 year because it's Cincinnati, Ohio, and he would like to go back and complete his studies in New York. So the president of the college, Isaac, right? Yes, and Isaac, I can show you the document. And Isaac Wise then writes him back a lovely letter in which he pays homage to his father, who he admires, Aaron Wise. And he says, but if you're going to come to study, this is a serious program, you have to be in Cincinnati for 4 years. And, of course, as we all know, apparently it would be preferable to be in Europe than to be in Cincinnati, and that's where Stephen Wise went to get his degree. Speaking of Dr. Saracen, and then we'll finish.
And Hirsch, of course, at one point suggested that moving to college to Chicago.
Yes.
I want to underscore something that David Langston highlighted, the complexity of this. Okay? Very often we get sound bites or we get typifications. Reform in the 19th century and in the early 20th century was no less complex than it is today. And even the notion of quote-unquote classical reform Judaism at one level is an oversimplification and a typification. And Howard's desire to move beyond those simple typifications in that regard is very commendable. These things were very complex because we're dealing with complex individuals. I mean, it's Einhorn who in fact opposed mixed marriages and who wouldn't perform them. You'd think it would be the other way around, but because of his own. And I had a question. I was wondering if you know anything about this. In terms of Isaac Mayer Wise's political moderation and the fact that he hated extremes, do we know what is in the 1840s, in the revolutionary 1840s in Central Europe, you know, where he was on that spectrum, and whether or not, to some extent, is that a response to what his experience was? I mean, Einhorn, of course, was a revolutionary.
Yeah, I've read everything that's published that I can on Wise, and I haven't. The only thing he does speak out against the disabilities that befell him. He hates them, you know, the matrical and so forth, and he speaks about that. But we have, as far as I know, there's no evidence of Wise being involved politically.
48 he was already.
Right.
He was
Right.
46, I know.
Right. So let's finish up by one last document that I want to show you electronically, and that is taking you now to the year 1940. And in 1940, Stephen Wise is giving a book review from his pulpit on one of the best sellers, and that was a book called Native Son. Native Son by Richard Wright. And this story, which I was compelled to read in high school, which apparently is no longer on the canon, but this story, in essence, is a story about how being brought up as an African American in the 20th century as in America perverts, twists your upbringing to such a degree that you're almost destined to have a calamity of a life. And Bigger Thomas, who's the main character in this book, finds himself in that predicament, and he's in a house, he wants to steal something, a woman comes in, a white woman, she screams, he puts a pillow over her face, and ends up killing her. Not because he wants to, but because he doesn't want her to scream. He then goes to trial. This is a book in short, and Richard Wright creates a character of the Jewish lawyer who defends Bigger Thomas. And at some point in the book, this African American writer says, in the mouth of the Jewish lawyer, he says, they for sure want this man, black man, to hang, because otherwise they wouldn't have picked a Jewish lawyer. In other words, in the 1940s, the idea that they picked someone who would be despicable to the jury, and thereby already put this black man at an even greater disadvantage. But he puts beautiful words into the mouth of the Jewish lawyer that is native son. And the book was a bestseller, so Stephen Wise, like a good rabbi, is going to give a review. And I mean, again, we started with Civil War and slavery, and now I want to show you how it goes beyond and continues on. This is the Emil Hirsch, we talked about that, and now Stephen Wise, one of our founders. Listen to what Wise says.
To me, as I read Native Son, the word of the mind and the understanding and compassionate soul of the Jewish lawyer became to me at one and the same time symbol, rebuke, prophecy, challenge. Symbol of what the Jew should be and do in relation to other races that are oppressed and ground into the dust. And I remember the very sage and shrewd observation personally made to me a generation ago by Israel Zengin, and repeated in one of his last volumes. If only the Jews could forget their own fate, however bitter, and remember and try to better the fate of another, some alien race, such as the Negro race. After all, we Jews, as no other people, we know the heart of the oppressed. And I can't help saying to you, if there be any Jews in this congregation today who hail from the South, they are likely profoundly to disagree with me, but I must speak the truth as I see it. The indifference of the Jew, child of 35 centuries of civilization, is over. The indifference of the Jew throughout the country, save for rarest exceptions, to the fate of the Negro race, is deep time is come, in part as a result of the writing of this extraordinary indictment of the white race in its study of abnormal criminality. The time is come for Americans to bethink themselves, to think through and over again the whole problem of relations. And I suppose I can't help feeling, what if others fail? What if Christians fail? What if Catholic and Protestant churches fail? Must we fail because they do? Must our Judaism remain a mockery and a pretense? Even if it be true that Christianity, Christendom has suffered oceanic and even infinite wrong, to be laid upon the body and the soul of the Negro race.
So, this is a very, first of all, the AJA has a whole collection, 171 of these sermons that Wise delivered between 1934 and 1942. And of course, Wise rarely spoke about anything other than what was going on in the world. And so this is, these are 80 years old, have been brought back to life through the digitization of these very poor quality recordings, and give us an opportunity to return to the seat of Carnegie Hall and actually listen to this man just as he spoke to these people so long ago. And you can see 14 years before Brown versus Board of Education, he doesn't pull any punches, does he? And he says, if there's any Southerners in this room, you're not going to like what I have to say. And then he says exactly what he thinks. And I point out to you this phrase that he uses, I am concerned about every human being who's oppressed on this world. What? He says, because I am an American and I am a Jew. He repeats this in many of his speeches. He's not into American Jew, Jewish American, and that sort of thing. He says period after each one of them, which again is another, I think, very interesting connection to the vision of our Reform founders, who saw this interplay between Judaism and Americanism, and that, many people have written about this vision of American Judaism. So, you see Wise, this is just an example of his ongoing, not only is he one of the conveners of the NAACP, but he preaches on this and so forth. So I finished my little booklet on page 19 and 20 by showing that if you look at the website of the Union, and you look at the website of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, you will see that we share this vision of a better world, of the universal concern for the problems of society. This is only, no one could have said it better, and I'm certainly not going to try, than Dr. Sussman today in the talk, that we're not different. We're all part of a unified, complex whole. And just as you could say that Dr. Sussman is in the Wisian tradition of Isaac Wise when he calls for moderation and says, that we need to hold hands and walk together, and we shouldn't divorce ourselves from our history, because we have a lot of good reason to be very proud of our history. I would commend to everyone in the room, but particularly the students, go on to HUC-alum. If you don't, I'll send it to you. Fred Gutman, just for some reason last night, wrote what I call a confessional. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. He just took some, he just took some paragraph that Rabbi Jacobs wrote about, the movement is a fast-growing movement, and we're going to continue to try to do everything we can to be a great movement in the future. And he writes this whole statement about how proud he is to be a Reformed Jew. That is Rabbi Gutman. And he doesn't it's not jingoism. He actually gives the reasons why. He says that because We believe in modernity, and because we believe in science, and we believe in a critical approach to the study of Judaism. We believe in making the world a better place. Well, where did he get this from? So when Rabbi Sussman teaches us earlier today, and he says, gee, what are we doing to ourselves when we teach, a negativity about our own heritage? We're doing ourselves in. He's absolutely right. And yet at the same time, we know that times have changed. And that we're in, times always change. What is it? Herodotus is the one who said you can't put your toe in. Yeah, Heraclitus, you can't put your toe in the same river, the river at the same river and in 2 times. It's always changing. So anyway, I want to thank the members of the society for several things. Thank you. Yeah, not for my applause, but I want to thank you for, first of all, for all the good things you do for the Hebrew Union College, how much it means to us, and we're grateful to you. We appreciate you coming here. You're our friends. You come and visit us more than anybody else, and we appreciate that. I want to thank Rabbi Berman for inviting me to participate and to teach. And I hope you have a wonderful, pleasant stay here. It was an honor to be with you. Thank you.
And Gary, thank you for everything, your always inspiring words, your wonderful hospitality. Today has been so incredibly rich and moving and powerful and challenging and provocative. And all kinds of good things. And that will continue tonight, where a very rare occasion will happen. You would never have found Isaac Mayer Wise and David Einhorn on the same platform. But tonight, their 2 successors will be in dialogue. Lance will first share his personal reflections about David Einhorn, and then Dr. Ellenson and Dr. Sussman will have a dialogue about the relationship between these 2 figures. That begins at 8 o'clock here in the electronic classroom. I hope you have your schedule of tomorrow's events, 2 important programs tomorrow as well. We'll see you later, and thank you for being here.